Thank you all for having me here today and allowing me to talk about something that's dear to my heart and to, I'm certain, the panel and many of you, and that is to talk about education and where we've been and where we're headed. The mind of a child is a precious thing. And who do you trust with our children? What are the people that we want teaching? And more importantly than that, what are the education standards that we want? I think of this statistic that a lot of our children spend more time at school than they even do in our homes now. I always enjoy any opportunity. I have an Anna Claire who is 9, and my one day sometimes before I fly out is on a Monday morning, and I'll teach and we'll talk stories or history, a little person of faith, pastor, former pastor, and I will talk about different things, biblical history as well, and just have some fun times and sharing, and every now and then she'll share back. And the other day, I remember her sharing a little bit about what she had learned through some of our discussions, and I was, kind of feeling pretty proud of myself that, hey, I'm quite the educator already. She was expounding quite eloquently about our Revolutionary days and talked about, she set it up nicely, but then she kept referring to the Roman soldiers instead of the redcoats. And I had to go back and break it back down. There was a difference. The Roman soldiers were a different time period than the actual redcoats. But nevertheless, we're all called to do something about sharing what we know, but also protecting the rights of the children in a way that they can be educated to the full extent. The mind of a child is a fragile, sponge-like, and so easy to stamp permanently in ways that shapes their tomorrows. As a former pastor, I've done a lot of counseling, and I've seen some of the heartbreaking stories of when information or exposure became prevalent in that child's life that actually caused many problems. But for this reason, every order of protection and effort is necessary to give them every opportunity for a brighter future. And let us not be mistaken. The future of our children is intimately and intrinsically linked with the future of this country. I see many young people in here today, and I think about what kind of country, specifically in the realm of education, that you will have for your children one day. Thwarting our children from the freedom of receiving the best education thwarts America from bringing up another exceptional generation of doctors, teachers, fathers, mothers, and leaders. In fact, we've often heard, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he or she is old, they won't depart from it. I think that's true in education as well. We've been trusted with a great responsibility, a high call to fight for their best. But a problem has been forming, really an avalanche. Over 50 years ago, when the ESEA was created by Lyndon Johnson, and then 35 years ago, we saw the Department of Education created by the Carter administration. And I've thought about this extensively. And there are many places where there's partisanship or there's different schools of thought, whether it's foreign policy or other areas. But it shouldn't be so anymore in education. Not to be too much of a pun, but the test results are in. We see the failure among our education. We spend $600 billion plus dollars. We spend $12,000 per student now. Yet we continue to fail, and specifically in our math and science. Should we not be proactive in the place of doing something about this? Well, with the help of my colleagues, that's what I intend to do. Number one, we must first cut through the red tape in D.C. And that sounds cliche at first, but the bureaucracy in Washington is unquestionably causing irrefutable damage to the children across this nation. I understand that's a strong statement. We must also fight to reduce the size and scope of the Department of Education. The current paperwork burden, now here's an amazing statistic, imposed on the Department of Education, that means the paperwork, is larger than the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of the Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Interior, and the Department of Justice combined. Think about the bureaucracy that's tied up in that. We must reduce the federal footprint in education by eliminating and consolidating programs. Simple solution. Instead of funneling money to the states through more than 100 competitive and formula grant operated by the Department of Education, we should scale back the number of programs and consolidate funding among many others. A lot of this is about control. We see it with the IRS, with nearly 75,000 pages of tax code regulations. The more discombobulated you have, the more control. Sometimes you'll go into an automobile dealership and they're getting you with this information, that information, this much paperwork, sit here in the booth, I'll get back with the numbers. Well, a lot of that, which is salesmanship, is a way to control the environment. That's what we've seen with the Department of Education. The second thing is we must stop allowing federal government to continue to make constitutional overreaches in our education. Let's be very clear. Parents know their children the best, not the bureaucrats sitting here behind desks in Washington, D.C. This shouldn't even be an argument. There is no one-size-fits-all that works best in education. As you think back today, and you think somebody that made an impact on your life, a coach, a teacher, most of the time the person that comes to your mind was somebody who got off the regular path, someone who maybe modified something for you, someone who took an interest specifically to you and didn't necessarily go by the book. But we think about those because we're created different. We have different ways of learning. And sometimes having people and teachers to be able to identify that. But with some of the standards that we see, it's very limited. To be able to even share, to be able to use our very talents and skills to impact our children. There is no one-size-fits-all. Programs like Common Core and No Child Left Behind are not only logistically flawed in their application and purpose, but are used as a leash to the purse strings in Washington as an excuse to filter billions of dollars to the states, but with a catch. Even in North Carolina, we saw this problem ourselves when we were accepting $400 million under a Race to the Top. I don't have time today to get into and expound all the problems with the Race to the Top, but I believe most of you would understand where we're coming from. These states are not permitted to use these dollars to satisfy the biggest problem, largest problematic areas, but they are focused to fund and to maintain the bureaucratic burdens required by these various overreaching federal programs and keep the states by playing by the rule book. Control again. Third, education will only be successful if two foundation truths are rediscovered in this country. The first is that parents know what is best for their child and should have the freedom to pursue the path that works for them. That's not a Republican or Democrat aspect. That is something that's common sense to most of us. Secondly, states must stand up to the federal government to reclaim constitutionally allotted freedoms to educate their children in their state without being yanked around by Washington. I imagine if we took a national poll across this country right now, I would reckon it'd be somewhere between 75 and 80%. In step with this, I feel like Congress should allow states to opt out of No Child Left Behind and direct dollars and decision-making to their most pressing educational needs. For these reasons and many more, I submitted the A+, or the Academic Partnerships Lead Us to Success Act, before the House earlier this year. Very excited to get that through an amendment. A lot of people predicted maybe 125 or 130 votes. We were thrilled to get 195. We're also reworking it right now. We've got 50 co-sponsors, and as Kelsey said earlier, she said, does it take a little persistence? I said, anything that's going to be accomplished in Washington, D.C., as you will all know, is going to take some persistence. Well, not only we talk about the red tape, but let me give you a little bit more details as far as the A+. Number one, of course, it aims to restore state and local control of education. Allows us to opt out. Under the A+ agreement, states would receive federal education funding in the form of block grants for the programs the state chooses to consolidate. No Child Left Behind would remain in force for any states that do not opt out. That's an important point, and here's why. Allowing a state to opt out of these federal mandates, but still allowing other states, if they wanted to stay in the program, could do so. You say, well, why is that important? Well, I think it comes in accountability. Because when you have two competing models, it then doesn't become hearsay. It doesn't become a political or partisan. In 5 to 10 years, you're comparing one. Here's a state that is allowing to reinvest and put those dollars where they feel like the need is. It's state issues, local issues, whatever it might be. Here's another one that's still operating the burdensome bureaucratic mandates of the last 35 and 50 years. I think you and I know which one would win out. So I think that's a great thing to allow the states to make that decision. People can make their own decision from then. A+ also seeks to reduce administrative costs and compliance burdens of federal education programs in order to focus federal resources on improving academic achievement. To ensure that states and communities are accountable to the public for advancing the academic achievement of all students, especially both gifted and disadvantaged children. A+ at its core is about making specific choices based on the evidence exists state by state. What is best for my state of North Carolina may not necessarily be best for California. A little bit of a minister privilege here. A lot of times you'll see that sometimes even in the church. You've got a model that works in California, may not work in North Carolina. Same kind of mindset, same kind of personality differences that we have to face. Finally, education reform has been an ever-present battle in this country. Over the last several decades, the federal government has usurped power from local municipalities, state governments, and worst of all, from the hands of mothers and fathers. It's not a dramatic statement. That should be one that concerns us all, that we've literally taken control from moms and dads. As a parent, I'm standing firm for the impressionable future of my children and for yours. They are far more important about money, this red tape, paper-pushing programs, bureaucracies developed in Washington, D.C. And without sounding too courageous, my goal here in being sent is to fight for them as long as it takes. Now, I'm not a career politician. I've never run for any office until I got so fed up with some of these bureaucracies that I decided to leave a ministry after 15 years to run this past year. And as a congressman, I hear the pleas of parents and constituents in our district who want the same. It shouldn't have ever been acceptable, but there is a rise in an optimism of people understanding that folks in Washington need to pay attention to our children and the future of this great nation, and not as a pawn piece for programming or for funding. As an American, I know we are well overdue for a paradigm shift in education. And if we don't change our inefficient, centralized, and blind approach soon, America, as we have known her, will be gone forever. Because it is through this education that great men and women have risen up to make a difference throughout the several hundred years of our country. And as a pastor, or former pastor, I should say, I pray for God's hand on our children. I pray He would keep them joyful, resilient, safe, and strong as we collectively fight for their better tomorrow. They are worth every effort as we march forward, resolutely, fearless, towards a tomorrow that shines much brighter than today. And in closing, I would leave this challenge. It's very easy to get caught up in the rhetoric of our policies and in the language. But as we look back, some of you much younger than I, some of you half the age as I challenge you to not only make a noise, but make a difference. Do whatever you can to implement your lives back into the place that you've been called. And when you can look back one day, whether it's 10, 15, 25, 30 years, you can be content and at peace knowing that you've made a difference. Thank you. God bless for the few minutes that we have with you today. It's a privilege.